The morning air at JFK International Airport was filled with the usual mix of excitement and rush. Travelers pulled their suitcases behind them, some moving quickly to catch their flights, others strolling slowly with coffee in hand. Among them was Michael Harris, a tall, confident man in his early 50s. He wasn't wearing anything flashy, just a neatly pressed navy suit, a crisp white shirt, and polished black shoes. His calm, focused expression gave away a man who had been through countless airports before. Michael wasn't just another business traveler. He was the CEO of a fast-growing technology company that had been making waves in the industry for the last 5 years. He had meetings lined up in San Francisco, including a deal that could shape the next chapter of his company's future. But despite his busy schedule, Michael didn't rush. He arrived at the airport early, checked in without a hitch, and headed toward the first-class lounge for a quiet moment before boarding. While waiting, Michael sat by a large glass window. Overlooking the runway, the sight of planes taking off against the bright morning sky always gave him a sense of calm. He pulled out his tablet, opened a presentation, and began reviewing his notes. A soft announcement over the speaker reminded passengers that his Flight 728, would begin boarding soon. Michael closed his tablet, gathered his belongings, and walked toward the gate. The gate area was bustling. Family of 4 sat nearby, the kids giggling over a tablet game. A young couple took selfies by the boarding sign, and a few solo travelers were absorbed in their phones. Michael stepped into the first-class boarding line. He greeted the gate agent with a polite smile, handed over his boarding pass, heard the soft beep that signaled approval as he stepped onto the jet bridge. The familiar scent of airplane. Air conditioning filled his senses. Michael had traveled so often that boarding a plane felt almost like walking into a second office. Inside the aircraft, soft background music played. The first-class section was neatly arranged, with wide leather seats and small folded blankets waiting for each passenger. Michael's seat was 2A, by the window. He placed his carry-on in the overhead bin, then settled into his seat with a relaxed sigh. From the window, he could see ground crew members moving around in bright vests, directing carts and checking equipment. A flight attendant approached. With a warm smile, "Good morning, sir. Can I offer you something to drink before takeoff? We have orange juice, sparkling water, and coffee ready." Michael chose orange juice, thanked her, and placed his tablet on the side table. As he took a sip, he glanced around. A few other passengers in first class were already seated, a businessman reading a newspaper, a woman typing quickly on her laptop, and an elderly gentleman who looked like he was enjoying a short nap. Everything felt peaceful. Michael returned to his work, scrolling through graphs and notes. The sound of boarding announcements and passengers chatting in the economy cabin created a low, pleasant hum in the background. He barely noticed the time passing until the last of the passengers began to trickle in. From his seat, he could see into the aisle where a mother was trying to find space for her stroller. A man in a baseball cap was struggling to fit his large backpack into the overhead bin. The flight attendants moved quickly and professionally, helping people find their seats. Michael appreciated their efficiency, after all. Smooth boarding meant an on-time departure. He leaned back, glancing at his watch. The flight was scheduled to leave in about 15 minutes. He was already picturing himself in San Francisco. In a few hours, stepping into the sunny streets and heading straight to his first meeting, everything seemed perfectly ordinary. Then, just as he adjusted his seatbelt, he noticed something unusual. One of the flight attendants, a younger woman, with neatly tied hair, walked briskly toward the front of the cabin. She had a focused expression, as if she had just remembered something important. She spoke briefly to another attendant near the cockpit door, and the two exchanged quick glances. Michael thought nothing of it at first. Airline staff often had last-minute tasks before takeoff, but within moments, the same attendant returned, her eyes scanning the first-class seats. She stopped near Michael's row, her professional smile returning, but her tone carrying a certain firmness. At that moment, Michael still had no idea how drastically his calm morning was about to change. For now, he simply placed his orange juice back on the table, ready to listen. He believed it would be something minor, perhaps a routine question or a small seating adjustment. The atmosphere in the cabin remained quiet. Most passengers were busy settling in. Michael adjusted his tie slightly, unaware that in just a few minutes this peaceful flight would turn into an unforgettable scene, one that every passenger on board would talk about long after they landed. The engines outside gave a soft rumble as the crew continued their preparations. The sunlight streamed through the windows, painting golden lines on the leather seats. Everything looked ordinary, almost serene. But for Michael, this was the calm before a storm he never saw coming. Michael looked up as the flight attendant stopped beside his seat. Her polite smile was still there, but her eyes held a seriousness that caught his attention. "Excuse me, sir," she began in a calm voice. "I'm going to need to speak with you about your seat." Michael blinked, unsure what she meant. "My seat?" he asked, glancing down at his boarding pass as if to double-check what was already certain. The pass clearly read 2A, the very spot where he was sitting. "Yes," she said, her voice staying polite but firm. "We have a passenger who needs to be seated here, and I'll have to ask you to move to a seat in economy." For a moment, Michael thought it was a misunderstanding. Perhaps she had confused him with someone else, or maybe she had meant to. "Speak to the person behind him." He gave a small, polite smile. "I think there must be a mistake," he said. "This is my assigned seat. I checked in early, and my boarding pass confirms it." The attendant nodded quickly, almost as if she had heard this kind of response before. "Yes, I understand. But there has been a change in seating arrangements. We'll need you to relocate." Michael kept his voice calm, but inside he felt puzzled. "I'm sorry, but I booked this seat well in advance. I'm traveling for business, and I specifically arranged for this so I could work during the flight. Could you please explain why this change is happening?" At this, another flight attendant, a tall man with neatly combed hair, walked up, joining the conversation. His tone was slightly more direct. "Sir, we have a VIP passenger who requires this seat. We'd appreciate your cooperation so we can begin our departure on time." Michael's eyebrows rose slightly. "A VIP?" He glanced around the cabin. The other passengers seemed to be minding their own business, but a few in nearby seats were now watching with curiosity. "Isn't every paying passenger important?" Michael asked, keeping his tone even. The male attendant's expression didn't change. "We understand your concern, sir, but we need to resolve this quickly." By now, the calm rhythm of the boarding process seemed to have shifted. There was a faint tension in the air, subtle but noticeable. The sound of passengers stowing luggage had quieted. It's down near the front as more eyes began to glance in Michael's direction. Michael, still composed, decided not to raise his voice or argue loudly. "I'd be happy to understand the reason for this switch," he said. "If there's a valid explanation, I'll consider it. But moving to economy when I've booked first class, that doesn't seem fair." The younger female attendant's polite smile tightened just slightly. "Sir, we can offer you a complimentary voucher for the inconvenience." Michael studied her expression for a moment. He wasn't upset in an obvious way, but his mind was turning. Something about this felt unusual. Airline seat changes happened. Yes, but rarely in this manner, and almost never with such urgency, especially in first class. He noticed a couple in the row across the aisle watching closely, whispering to each other. In the back, someone had pulled out a phone, holding it in a way that might have been filming. The male attendant spoke again, his tone even firmer now. "Sir, please understand we're trying to maintain the schedule. If you could move now, we can resolve this matter without delay." Michael's eyes narrowed slightly, but his voice stayed level. "And if I choose not to," there was a pause. The two attendants exchanged a glance, the kind that said they wanted to avoid this dragging out. The male attendant said, "Then we will have to involve the captain, and it may delay the flight." Michael knew what that meant. If the captain got involved, the situation could escalate, even if he wasn't doing anything wrong. Airlines preferred to keep things moving, and any passenger who slowed the process could be labeled uncooperative, regardless of the reason. For a brief moment, Michael considered standing his ground completely. He had every right to remain in the seat he had purchased, but he also knew there were times to pick a battle and times to step back, observe, and act later. He gave a small, measured nod. "All right, he said, slowly unbuckling his seatbelt. If this is what's necessary for the flight to depart on time, I'll move. The attendant seemed relieved, though neither said much beyond a brief thank you. The female attendant motioned toward a seat in economy, and Michael followed her down the aisle. As he walked, he could feel the quiet weight of dozens of eyes on him. In the economy cabin, she pointed to an aisle seat in the middle of the plane. It was narrower, with less legroom, and already had a folded blanket and pillow from the previous passenger. Michael set his bag in the overhead bin and sat down, adjusting his suit jacket as he settled in around him, passengers in the economy. Section glanced at him with faint curiosity, wondering why a man dressed for first class was now seated among them. Michael simply gave a polite nod to the person sitting next to him, an older gentleman who smiled warmly but didn't ask questions. As the plane continued boarding, Michael tried to refocus on his tablet, but his mind replayed the exchange in the front cabin. The words VIP passenger echoed in his thoughts. He had been in business long enough to know that not all VIP situations were what they appeared to be. A few minutes later, as the last passengers boarded, Michael overheard something. 2 seats ahead, flight attendant quietly spoke to another crew member. The special passengers all set in 2A. Let's just make sure everything's perfect for them. Michael's expression remained neutral, but inside, a piece of the puzzle had shifted. This wasn't just a random seat reassignment. There was more to it, and he intended to find out what. He closed his tablet and leaned back slightly, not in defeat, but in thought. The hum of the engines starting up filled the cabin, and the crew prepared for takeoff. Michael's eyes were calm, but his mind was already making decisions. Some passengers might have let the incident go, chalking it up to bad luck. Michael Harris was not one of those passengers. Michael sat quietly in his new seat, the soft hum of the engines filling the cabin. Round him, passengers were buckling their seatbelts, adjusting their pillows, and tucking away their devices for takeoff. To anyone looking, he seemed calm. Maybe just another business traveler making the best of an inconvenient situation. But inside, Michael's thoughts were sharp, focused. The seat swap was still fresh in his mind. He could accept last-minute changes if there was a genuine reason, an emergency, a technical issue, or a special accommodation for someone in need. But the way it had been handled left him with questions. The phrase VIP passenger echoed again in his head, lingering like a riddle waiting to be solved. The flight attendants moved briskly down the aisle, checking seatbelts and making sure tray tables were up. One of them paused near Michael's ROW, offering a polite but brief smile before continuing. He noticed it wasn't the warm, welcoming kind of smile he had received when boarding earlier. Michael didn't take it personally, but he didn't forget it either. The plane began to taxi toward the runway, the cabin gently vibrating as the engines roared to life. Outside the small oval window, lights on the tarmac blurred into streaks as they rolled forward. The captain's voice came over the speaker, greeting everyone and giving the flight time. It was routine, steady, and professional. But Michael barely heard it. His attention kept drifting to the front of the plane, imagining the seat he had originally been in. To a seat with space, privacy, and comfort. The place he had planned to work, read, and arrive rested for his meetings. Now someone else was sitting there. The plane lifted off, the gentle pressure pushing passengers back into their seats. The city lights below became tiny, scattered stars on the dark ground. Michael inhaled slowly, letting the moment pass. He was not the kind of man to act impulsively. If there was one thing years in business had taught him, it was that patience often revealed more than immediate action. Once they reached cruising altitude, the cabin lights dimmed slightly, and the attendants began moving carts down the aisle. Michael opened his tablet again, scrolling through his presentation slides. But his concentration kept breaking. A faint murmur of conversation floated from the front of the cabin, too distant to make out clearly. Every so often, he saw the shadow of a flight attendant moving between first class and the galley, carrying drinks or trays. Something about the way they moved felt deliberate, as if they were paying extra attention to someone up there. The passenger seated beside Michael struck up a friendly conversation. His name was Daniel, a retired teacher visiting his daughter on the West Coast. He spoke warmly about his love for travel, sharing small stories about past trips. Michael listened politely, even smiling at a few anecdotes. Mind was still circling the earlier incident. Midway through the flight, Michael excused himself to stretch his legs. He walked slowly toward the restroom at the front of the economy section. As he stood in line, he glanced toward the curtain separating economy from first class. It was partially open, just enough to give him a glimpse. There, in seat 2A, sat a man in his late 40s, wearing a sharp gray suit. He was speaking animatedly with one of the attendants, who leaned in slightly as she listened. The man gestured with his hands, smiling with the ease of someone who felt entirely at home in the seat. Michael didn't recognize him, but something about the way the crew interacted with him made it clear this was the so-called VIP passenger. Michael returned to his seat quietly, his steps measured. He wasn't upset in a loud or obvious way, but there was a firmness in his thoughts now. This wasn't just a matter of losing a seat, it was about how it had been done and what it implied. Dinner service began, and Michael accepted the simple meal offered in economy. He ate without rush, his mind working in the background. He thought about his role as CEO. He thought about how he had built his company. Not just with skill, but with a belief in fairness, treating clients, partners, and even competitors with respect. And now here he was, being quietly shifted aside without explanation, all to make room for someone deemed more important. The more he considered it, the more it became clear. This wasn't an issue to let slide. It's not because of ego, but because of principle. If it could happen to him, it could happen to anyone. The lights in the cabin dimmed as the flight settled into its long, steady rhythm. Many passengers dozed off, while others watched movies on small screens. Michael stayed awake, leaning back. In his seat, his eyes half closed, not in sleep, but in thought. He began to form a plan. There was no need to confront anyone now, mid-flight. That would only create unnecessary disruption. But once they landed, there would be opportunities, ways to address the situation directly and effectively. As the hours passed, the hum of the engines became like background music. Michael's mind felt clear. He knew exactly what steps to take, and he knew who to call. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. From the outside, he looked like a passenger simply enduring a less comfortable seat than planned. Inside, he was preparing for a quiet but decisive move, one that would shift the balance of the situation entirely. The seat swap had been meant to move him out of the way. In reality, it had only set him in motion. The seatbelt sign lit up again as the plane began its descent into San Francisco. The gentle hum of the engines grew louder as the aircraft angled downward. Around Michael, passengers started to stir, stretching and gathering their belongings. He closed his tablet, sliding it into his carry-on bag. On the surface, he looked like a man simply ready to get off a flight, but in truth, his mind was sharper than ever. The hours in the air had given him time to think clearly. Every detail of what happened, the approach of the attendants, the vague VIP explanation, the hurried relocation was fresh in his mind. He knew exactly how to respond. As the wheels touched down with a soft thud, a ripple of relief moved through the cabin. Some passengers clapped quietly. Others smiled at the thought of finally reaching their destination. Jacket, his expression calm but determined. The moment the plane rolled to a stop at the gate, the seatbelt sign went off, and people began standing, reaching for overhead bins. Michael remained seated, letting the rush pass him by. He had no intention of joining the crowd pushing toward the door. Instead, he waited because he knew the timing of his next move mattered. The curtain between first class and economy opened briefly as one of the attendants stepped through, checking the aisle. Michael watched her without speaking, his face unreadable. She looked in his direction, but didn't linger, moving on quickly. When it was finally his turn to step off the plane, Michael moved with steady steps, neither slow nor hurried. The cool air of the jet bridge met him, and just ahead, the first-class passengers were already walking toward the terminal. Among them, the man in the gray suit from seat 2A moved confidently, talking to another passenger. Michael didn't approach him. This wasn't about a direct confrontation. His focus was somewhere else entirely, inside the terminal. The familiar rhythm of airport life greeted him, the sound of rolling suitcases, the faint smell of coffee from a nearby kiosk, the muffled announcements over the PA system. Michael walked with a clear destination in mind. Just before reaching the baggage claim area, stopped near a quiet corner where the airline's customer service office was located. A woman in a navy blazer sat behind the counter, typing on a computer. She looked up as Michael approached, offering a polite smile. "Good afternoon," Michael said, his voice calm but firm. "I'd like to speak with the regional operations manager. It's regarding a matter on Flight 728. The woman hesitated for a moment, as if she wasn't used to passengers making such a direct request. "May I ask the nature of the matter, sir?" Michael met her eyes. "It concerns an incident involving the crew, and it needs to be addressed immediately." Something in his tone told her this wasn't a casual complaint. She picked up the phone, dialed a number, and spoke briefly before hanging up. "Someone will be here shortly," she said. Michael stepped aside, watching travelers pass by while keeping an eye on the office door. Within minutes, a tall man in a suit arrived, his ID badge identifying him as the regional operations manager. He carried himself with the kind of authority that came from years of handling complex situations. "Mr. Harris?" he asked, extending his hand. Michael shook it firmly. "Yes, thank you for coming." They moved a few steps away from the counter. "For privacy." Michael recounted the events on the plane, speaking clearly and without exaggeration. He described being asked to give up his seat without explanation beyond the vague mention of a VIP, a lack of proper communication, and the way it was handled. The manager listened carefully, nodding occasionally, but not interrupting. When Michael finished, there was a short pause. "Mr. Harris," the manager said slowly, "I appreciate you bringing this directly to my attention. I'll be frank, I'm aware of who you are. I also know the role your company plays in our operations through our parent organization." Michael's expression didn't change. "Then you understand why I'm concerned." The manager nodded again, his tone turning serious. "Yes, I do. And I assure you, this will be addressed immediately." Without another word, the manager pulled out his phone and made a call. His voice stayed low, but the urgency in his tone was unmistakable. After a brief exchange, he ended the call and looked at Michael. "Please wait here for a moment." "He," said Michael, agreed, leaning casually against the wall, his hands in his pockets. He watched as the manager walked briskly toward the gate area. Disappearing from view 10 minutes later, Michael saw movement near the jet bridge. The same crew from Flight 728, the captain, the attendants, and even the male attendant who had asked him to move, emerged together, their expressions tense. They followed the manager toward a separate corridor, away from the public eye. Michael didn't hear the conversation that followed, but the body language spoke volumes. The manager's posture was firm, the crew's faces a mix of surprise and discomfort. One attendant glanced toward Michael, briefly before looking away. The scene lasted only a few minutes before the crew was escorted further down the corridor, out of sight. "Duh." The manager returned, his expression composed but resolute. "Mr. Harris," he said, "the matter has been handled. I can't share internal details, but I can assure you that corrective action has been taken." Michael gave a single nod. "Thank you. I trust it will be handled with the seriousness it deserves." The manager's voice softened slightly. "It will. I'd also like to arrange for your travel today to be completed in the comfort you originally booked. We have a flight departing in 2 hours, and you'll be seated in first class, as intended." Michael accepted the arrangement without unnecessary words. The result was clear. The problem had been addressed swiftly. And without him needing to raise his voice or create a public scene as he walked toward the lounge to wait for his next flight, Michael reflected on the morning. In the end, the real statement hadn't been made through an argument or a heated exchange. It had been made quietly through the right channels, by letting the right people know exactly what had happened. And while the other passengers from Flight 7228 might never know the details, the lesson had been left exactly where it needed to be, with the crew who had underestimated the man in seat 2A. The first-class lounge at San Francisco International Airport was quiet compared to the busy terminal outside. Large windows looked out over the runway, where planes moved like slow, graceful birds preparing for their next journey. Inside, soft music played and the scent of freshly brewed coffee filled the air. Michael sat at a corner table, a cup of green tea steaming in front of him. He had used the time to send a few emails, review the schedule for his meetings, and confirm arrangements with his assistant. But every so often, his thoughts drifted back to the earlier flight. He wasn't replaying it out of frustration. He had already acted, and the matter had been resolved. Instead, he thought about the principle behind what had happened. The seat change wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a decision made on assumptions. Someone had looked at him and decided that his place, his booking, and his comfort could be set aside for someone else. Without proper explanation or respect, Michael wasn't the kind of person to let such decisions pass without notice, he believed. That respect was a two-way street in business and in life. A soft announcement came over the lounge speakers. Calling first-class passengers for the upcoming flight to Los Angeles, the first leg of his rescheduled journey to San Francisco's connecting meetings. Michael gathered his belongings, thanked the lounge staff, and walked calmly toward the gate. When he arrived, a gate agent greeted him warmly, almost with a hint of extra courtesy. "Good afternoon, Mr. Harris," she said. "We're so glad to have you flying with us today. Your seat is ready." She scanned his boarding pass and the gate beeped softly in approval. Michael stepped onto the jet bridge and into the aircraft. This time, there was no tension, no hesitation. The crew in the first-class cabin smiled and welcomed him as if they had been expecting him personally. "Good afternoon, Mr. Harris," one of them said. "May we offer you a welcome drink?" Michael nodded politely. "Sparkling water, please." He settled into his seat again placing his bag neatly in the overhead bin. The leather felt smooth and comfortable beneath his hands. Space was exactly what he had booked in the first place. Roomy, private, and peaceful. As the other passengers boarded, Michael glanced around the cabin. Everyone was settling in quietly. No commotion, no sudden seat reassignments. He opened his tablet once more, making final notes for the meeting he would attend upon arrival. A few minutes later, the regional operations manager from earlier appeared at the front of the cabin. He wasn't in uniform now. He had clearly come to see Michael off before the flight departed. "Mr. Harris," the manager said quietly, "I wanted to thank you for your patience earlier today. I also wanted to assure you personally that the crew from the earlier flight has been relieved of their duties pending a full review. Our company values professionalism above all else, and we take incidents like this very seriously." Michael nodded once, his expression calm. "I appreciate that. My hope is that this becomes a learning opportunity, not just a reaction to one incident." The manager smiled faintly, as if he understood exactly what Michael meant. "I agree, and I believe it will be." With that, the manager shook Michael's hand and left the plane. The rest of the boarding process continued smoothly. The captain greeted the passengers over the speaker. The crew prepared for departure, and the soft hum of the engines began to build. The plane rolled toward the runway, sunlight streaming in through the windows. As the wheels lifted off and the city below grew smaller, Michael leaned back, letting the quiet comfort of the cabin surround him. He didn't need to tell anyone around him what had happened earlier in the day. The people who needed to know already knew, and the results had spoken for themselves. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he thought about the passengers on the earlier flight. A few of them had seen him being asked to move. A few had likely wondered why, and some may have even guessed there was more to the story, but they wouldn't know was how quickly and quietly the entire situation had been turned around. Midway through the flight, the attendant brought his meal, a carefully plated dish with fresh bread and a small dessert. She placed it gently on the table in front of him, smiling warmly. "If there's anything else you need during the flight, Mr. Harris, please don't hesitate to let us know." Michael thanked her and began eating, taking his time. The truth was, the victory wasn't in getting back to a first-class seat. It was in knowing that he had handled the situation with dignity, without raising his voice, without causing unnecessary disruption, and still achieved results. He knew that the crew from the earlier flight would remember the day, not because of who he was, but because of the way their actions had been addressed. And perhaps in the future, they would think twice before treating any passenger as if they didn't matter. By the time the plane began its descent, the sky outside had turned a deep orange, the sunset stretching across the horizon. The city lights below flickered like tiny stars, welcoming the arriving travelers. As the plane touched down, Michael felt the same calm focus he had that morning. His schedule would continue, his meetings would happen, the day would move forward. But somewhere in the airline's records, there would be a note about Flight 728, a note that made it clear: respect matters. When the door opened and passengers began filing out, Michael stepped onto the jet bridge without hurry. The air outside was cool, carrying the faint scent of the ocean. He walked through the terminal with steady steps, his carry-on rolling behind him. To anyone watching, he was simply another traveler arriving at his destination. But he knew. And the airline knew that the quiet events of the day had left a lasting mark. Sometimes, change didn't come with noise or headlines. Sometimes it came in the form of a calm man in seat 2A who knew when to step aside and exactly when to step forward.